Hey everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most pivotal moments in modern history, the American Revolution. How did a collection of British colonies manage to take on the world's greatest superpower and forge a brand new nation? Well, grab your popcorn, because this story has more drama, twists, and turns than a blockbuster movie. Let's rewind to the mid-18th century. America wasn't America yet. It was 13 separate colonies, all under the rule of Great Britain. For a long time, the relationship was pretty decent. Britain practiced something called salutary neglect, which is a fancy way of saying they mostly left the colonies to their own devices. The colonists were developing their own unique identity, their own economies, and a fierce sense of independence. They were British subjects, sure, but they were also American. So what changed? In a word, money. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, was a massive, global conflict. Britain won, which was great for them, but it left them with a mountain of debt. King George III in the British Parliament looked across the Atlantic and thought, hey, we just spent a fortune defending the colonies. It's only fair they help pay for it. This is where things start to get heated. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. This wasn't about postage stamps. It was a tax on all sorts of paper goods, legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards. The colonists were furious, but it wasn't just about the money. Their rallying cry became no taxation without representation. They had no elected representatives in the British Parliament, so they argued that Parliament had no right to tax them directly. It was a matter of principle. The protests were so intense, with boycotts and even riots, that Britain eventually backed down and repealed the Stamp Act. But the argument was far from over. Parliament still insisted they had the right to govern the colonies. So they tried again, this time with the Townshend Acts, which taxed things like glass, lead, paint, and tea. Once again, the colonists resisted. Tensions escalated, and in 1770, it all boiled over in the Boston Massacre. British soldiers, taunted by a crowd, fired into the mob, killing 5 colonists. It was a shocking event, and figures like Paul Revere made sure everyone knew about it, using it as powerful propaganda to turn public opinion against the British. The British repealed most of the Townshend taxes except for one, the tax on tea. This was their way of saying we still have authority over you. The colonists responded with one of the most famous acts of defiance in history, the Boston Tea Party. In December 1773, a group of colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded 3 British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. That's over 90,000 pounds of tea, worth a fortune today. King George and Parliament were absolutely livid. They saw this not as a protest, but as a direct challenge to their rule. Their response was swift and harsh. They passed a series of laws known as the Coercive Acts, or as the colonists called them, the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, restricted town meetings, and gave more power to the British-appointed governor. This was the final straw. Instead of isolating Boston, the Intolerable Acts united the colonies. They realized that what happened to Massachusetts could happen to any of them. In 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They weren't calling for independence just yet. They sent a petition to the king, hoping for a peaceful resolution. But they also called for a complete boycott of British goods and urged the colonies to start training their militias. They were preparing for the worst. The worst came on April 19, 1775. British troops marched from Boston to the nearby towns of Lexington and Concord to seize a cache of colonial weapons. But the colonists were ready. Thanks to riders like Paul Revere, the local militia known as Minutemen were alerted. On Lexington Green, a shot rang out. The shot heard round the world. No one knows for sure who fired first, but the battle had begun. The British easily dispersed the small group at Lexington, but at Concord, they were met by a much larger force. On their march back to Boston, the British soldiers were harassed and ambushed by thousands of colonial militiamen firing from behind trees, walls, and houses. The American Revolution had started. A month later, the Second Continental Congress convened. This time, they acted as a makeshift government for the colonies. They established the Continental Army and, in a crucial decision, appointed a Virginian delegate named George Washington wasn't the most experienced general, but he had a commanding presence and an unshakable resolve that inspired loyalty. Still, the idea of complete independence was a radical one. Many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. The person who arguably did more than anyone to change their minds was a writer named Thomas Paine. In early 1776, he published a pamphlet called Common Sense, written in plain, powerful language that everyone could understand. It attacked the very idea of monarchy and made a passionate, logical case for American independence. It was an instant bestseller and spread like wildfire, convincing countless people that breaking away from Britain was not just possible but necessary. Inspired by this new wave of revolutionary fervor, the Continental Congress decided to take the final step. A committee, which included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, was tasked with drafting a formal declaration. Jefferson, a brilliant writer, did most of the work. On July 4, 1776, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. This document did more than just declare a new nation. It laid out a philosophy of government, stating that all men are created equal with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, declaring independence is one thing. Winning it is another. The war that followed was long, bloody, and incredibly difficult. The Continental Army was an underdog in every sense of the word. They were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and often went without pay, food, or even shoes. They were up against the most powerful professional army and navy in the world. The early years of the war were tough for the Americans, with many defeats. A turning point came on Christmas night in 1776. In a daring move, Washington led his freezing troops across the icy Delaware River to launch a surprise attack on Hessian mercenaries. German soldiers, hired by the British in Trenton, New Jersey. This victory was a huge morale booster, but the most significant turning point was the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. The American victory there was so decisive that it convinced France to officially enter the war as an ally of the United States. This was a game changer. French money, weapons, soldiers, and most importantly, their powerful navy were now on the American side. Spain and the Netherlands later joined the fight against Britain as well, turning the colonial rebellion into a global war. The final major battle took place at Yorktown, Virginia, in 1781. Surrounded on land by a combined force of American and French troops, and trapped at sea by the French Navy, the British General Cornwallis was forced to surrender his entire army. The victory at Yorktown effectively ended the war. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. The experiment that had begun with protests over taxes had resulted in the birth of a new nation, founded on the ideals of liberty and self-government. The American Revolution was more than just a war. It was a revolution of thought. It inspired countless other movements for independence and democracy. The story of how a group of determined colonists took on an empire and won is a powerful reminder that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this journey through history interesting, do we forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world? Let us know in the comments what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. See you in the next video.